He knocked on the back door with his arm in a sling and smiled. Within an hour, 2 girls would be dead, and the police still wouldn't know his name. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you up at night in the best way, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep digging up cases like this one. Now, let's go back to where it all began. According to psychiatry, a psychopath is not legally insane. He knows exactly the difference between right and wrong. These individuals show no deficit in intelligence, no obvious psychosis, no brain damage. What drives them is an inability to feel empathy, and they act on that void without hesitation. During the spring and summer of 1974, in the northwestern United States, a psychopath began a wave of attacks that terrorized the region. Young college women started vanishing from major campuses, some last seen just steps from their sorority houses, others disappearing from small towns. In the dead of night, when their bodies were found, they bore signs of sexual violence and strangulation. The victims shared a chilling pattern: young, white, slender, with long hair parted down the middle, and they always vanished at night. Witnesses recalled a strange man near the campuses, often wearing a sling or a cast, appearing vulnerable, asking for help. A few women, sensing something was wrong, refused to walk him to his car, some instinct telling them he might be a predator. As the disappearances mounted, so did public outrage. Pressure on the authorities grew, and reporters began asking why none of the missing girls' bodies had turned up, a silence that made many assume they were already dead. At the time, King County, where many of the disappearances occurred, saw these crimes consume an unprecedented share of police work in an area once considered quiet. In 1972, the county had recorded only 11 homicides, 9 of them solved. By 1974, everything had changed, and a wave of murders attributed to a single man, known only as Ted, shocked the nation. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Nathaniel Reed, and welcome back to Lost Bones. Today we're covering one of the most infamous cases in true crime history. We've put together a detailed account covering every angle of this disturbing story, centered on one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Since the mid-1950s, Chi Delta House had been one of the most prestigious sororities on the campus of Florida State University, and in 1978, nothing had changed. The house was full of young women considered the prettiest, the smartest, the most popular, heirs, in a sense, to the legacies their mothers and grandmothers had built inside those same walls. But on the night of January 14th, a Saturday, that history would be shattered. While most students partied at the campus's famous keg party, the girls of Chi Delta had their own plans. Some went on dates, others to the clubs, a few visited family. Only a handful were home when the night wore on. Around 3 a.m., Nora Hayes came back to the house and immediately noticed something wrong. The back door lock had been forced open. Before she could react, a loud crash echoed through the building. Frightened, she ducked out of sight, and through a crack in a door, she watched a lean man hurry down the stairs. He wore a dark jacket, a navy blue knit cap, carried something wrapped in cloth that looked like a club, and had a sharp, pronounced nose. Once the man left the house, Nora woke her roommate. "Someone's in the house," she whispered. "I saw him leave. We have to check on the others." Armed with nothing but an umbrella, the two crept down the hallway. There they found Kate Chandler, staggering, her face covered in blood. The horror only deepened when they found another housemate, Chloe Fenwick, sitting on the edge of her bed, bleeding and moaning in pain. Panic swept through the house. Nora finally dialed emergency services and asked for an ambulance. The dispatcher, misunderstanding the call, told police it sounded like 2 girls had fought over a man, and passed that version to the Tallahassee Police Department. Officer Oliver Barnes arrived expecting something routine. What he found instead was a scene of pure horror. The victims' jaws fractured, their heads gashed open, blood soaking the walls and bedding. Splinters of oak wood littered the floor, hinting at the brutality of the weapon. As officers gathered the remaining housemates, they realized two girls were missing, Lisa Hartley and Melissa Nolan. When police entered Lisa's room, they found her lying at an unnatural angle. Paramedic David Allen tried to revive her, but it was already too late. Her skin was cold, her lips blue. The marks of strangulation and animal-like bite wounds on her body made it clear something monstrous had passed through that room in the night. Still in the room, an officer found a hairspray canister in the trash, soiled and matted with small hairs. It would later be identified as the weapon used to sexually assault Lisa. At the same moment, Melissa Nolan was being gently woken by an officer in her own room. To everyone's relief, she was unharmed. As the house mother counted heads, she realized one more girl was unaccounted for. "Margaret Bowen isn't back yet," she said. Melissa spoke up. "I talked to her earlier when she got in." Officers rushed to Margaret's room. In the glow of a street lamp outside the window, they saw her body lying face down on the bed. Blood soaked the pillow. Pantyhose had been crudely wound around her neck. A strange fluid seeped from the right side of her skull, which had been shattered, part of the brain exposed. Bark and splinters of wood were scattered across the bed and even on Margaret's face. The Tallahassee Police Department now had 2 dead girls and 2 others critically injured. Chi Delta House was sealed off immediately, and the surviving young women were taken for emergency care. The investigators could only ask themselves one question, over and over: how had no one heard anything? Still in the small hours, Chi Delta House filled with cars from the Tallahassee Police Department, the Leon County Sheriff's Office, and University Police. Officer Oliver Barnes walked the grounds and found splinters of bark identical to those found in the bedrooms. He and other investigators believed the killer had likely grabbed a fallen tree branch from the yard before slipping in through the back. Barnes and Sergeant Howard Kessler dusted for fingerprints on the bedroom doors, the poster-covered walls, the broken back door lock, but found nothing usable. In Margaret's room, however, they discovered a package of brand-new pantyhose tossed into an empty wastebasket, suggesting the killer had brought his own ligature with him. When Sheriff Kenneth Sartoris of Leon County heard about the attack, he was stunned by its brutality. Patrol units flooded the campus, hunting for a man with a sharp, pronounced nose. A surveillance van was deployed, and several young men were stopped and questioned. But the suspect had vanished without a trace. Morning had not yet come, and the night wasn't finished with Tallahassee. Just a few streets from the sorority house, a young woman was jolted awake by loud noises coming from a duplex next door, where a friend lived. She woke her roommate, and the two of them listened, trying to make sense of the sounds, until they heard groaning, pained and low. Frightened, they called the house. No one answered. They called the police instead. Sheriff Sartoris was the first to arrive, already turning over a horrifying theory in his head, that whoever had struck the sorority house might be moving across the whole campus in a single, sprawling rampage. He kicked in the front door and found dance student Cheryl Thompson, 21, sitting up in bed, her face a mess of blood. It was the same scene, all over. Again, the one already burned into the memory of every officer and paramedic that night. At the foot of the bed lay a mask made from a woman's stocking. 2 strands of male hair recovered from it would later help identify the killer. Blood evidence, semen samples, and partial fingerprints were all collected, but the evidence was thin, enough only to narrow down a blood type. Given the pattern, investigators concluded the same man responsible for the sorority attack had struck Cheryl Thompson. 2. At the hospital, doctors found her shoulder dislocated, her jaw fractured, and her skull broken in 5 places. That she survived it all stunned everyone. Cheryl would never fully regain hearing in her left ear, and the damage to her balance ended her dancing career for good. That single night of violence launched an unprecedented manhunt. Nothing like it had ever unfolded on a college campus before, but it was only the beginning of something that would place Tallahassee at the center of one of the most consequential investigations in American history. Nearly a month after the Chi Delta murders, the Jacksonville Police Department logged a report of an attempted abduction. A man driving a white van had approached 14-year-old Allison Parmenter while she waited for her brother to pick her up from the parking lot of her high school. It was raining, and Allison didn't notice the van pull up beside her. A man stepped out, wearing plaid pants and a dark military-style jacket. His beard was unkempt, his hair wavy, his glasses dark-framed. He told her he was with the fire department and started asking questions. Pinned to his jacket was a badge reading Fire Department, along with an ID naming him Richard Burton. But something about him felt wrong to Allison. His eyes seemed empty, his clothes dirty, nothing like a real firefighter. She remembered her father's warning immediately. Her father, James Parmenter, was a detective with the Jacksonville Police Department, and he'd always told her, never talk to strangers. Allison tried to walk past the man without answering, but he blocked her path, his questions growing more insistent, until her brother finally pulled up in his truck. "Get in the car," he told her sharply, then turned to the stranger. "What do you want with her?" The man grew agitated and hurried back to his van. As it pulled away, Allison's brother memorized the plate. When the report reached her father, he ran the plate and traced it to a man named Randall Reagan of Tallahassee. But buried under other cases, it would be a while before he could chase the lead. Around the same time, the police department of nearby Lake City, sitting between Jacksonville and Tallahassee, logged a disappearance. The victim was 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach. According to her parents, she'd vanished from her school parking lot without a trace. Detective Parmenter, meanwhile, called the Leon County Sheriff's Office to dig up more on Randall Reagan, owner of the white van. He spoke with investigator Stephen Bradford, who ran the plate and tracked down Reagan, only to learn the man had reported his own plate stolen weeks earlier and requested a replacement. Bradford knew the Chi Delta case well. He also knew Reagan lived close to the duplex where Cheryl Thompson had been attacked. His instincts told him there might be a connection, a feeling that only sharpened when he heard about Kimberly Leach's disappearance. If the same man behind the Chi Delta attack had gotten hold of Kimberly, the investigators knew there was little chance she was still alive. When James Parmenter learned of these overlapping threads, he was shaken by how close his own daughter had come to a deeply dangerous man. For days, the search for Kimberly continued with no leads, until one event changed everything. Nearly a week later, Officer Daniel Lee of the Pensacola Police Department was patrolling West Pensacola when he spotted a suspicious orange Volkswagen Beetle circling a restaurant. Running the plate, he discovered the car was stolen. Lee gave chase, a pursuit that stretched almost 2 miles before the driver finally gave up and pulled over. Lee ordered the driver out, moving in to cuff him. Without warning, the man lunged, and the two grappled. He broke free and bolted. Lee fired, and the man went down. But when the officer approached, thinking he'd hit his mark, the man surged back up and attacked again, clearly meaning to kill him. Only Lee's experience let him wrestle the man down and finally get him cuffed. On the ride to the station, the man grew strangely, deeply despondent, telling Lee he wished he'd been killed. Lee was baffled. The man wasn't drunk, wasn't high, just hollow. At the station, on-duty detective Norman Chapman Jr. was assigned to the interview. He asked for the man's name. "Kenneth Raymond Misner," the man answered. But Chapman already had a problem. The Beetle had yielded 3 complete sets of ID, each under a different student's name, along with 21 stolen credit cards, a stolen television, stolen license plates, and a bicycle. Chapman had no idea who this man really was, but the stolen goods pointed straight to 2 other jurisdictions, Tallahassee and Leon County. Both departments were notified, and the next day, Detective Don Patchen from Tallahassee and Stephen Bradford from Leon County came to question him. The man agreed to be recorded, but refused to give his real name, asking instead for a lawyer and a priest. The silence held until February 16, 1978, when he suddenly changed his tone. "My name is Robert Bundy," he announced. He seemed to expect a dramatic reaction. None came. No one recognized the name. Frustrated, he watched as officers flipped through an FBI bulletin. And then it hit them. Theodore Bundy was one of the 10 most wanted men in America. The rap sheet was long: theft, assault, kidnapping, homicide, plus 2 dramatic prison escapes. As the interrogation went on, Bundy swung between icy calm and sudden emotional outbursts, crying when he spoke about his own life, but slipping deftly away whenever the questions turned to his crimes. Detective Chapman, thinking of the Tallahassee attacks, decided to test him. "Did you ever try to wipe away your fingerprints?" Bundy began to cry and admitted he wore leather gloves. Asked about a white van stolen near a college campus, he refused to answer at all. The questioning moved to Colorado, the disappearance and murder of a young college student. Bundy insisted he knew nothing, but under pressure let slip that he'd seen the autopsy photos. That was the moment he asked for the recorder to be shut off. What happened next exists only in the investigators' handwritten notes. Without the tape running, Bundy seemed to loosen up. He called himself a vampire. He admitted to being a compulsive voyeur, stalking young women in the dark. When asked if he'd ever turned those fantasies into something real, he said his fantasies had taken over his whole life, but that the acts themselves always left him disappointed. By then, investigators suspected Bundy in at least 36 kidnappings and murders. When Chapman put that number to him directly, Bundy's answer landed like a blow. "You need to add another digit," he said flatly. The room went silent. Did he mean 37 victims? Or something well over 100? From that point on, Bundy grew more careful. Still, he admitted to violent urges toward women and revealed one more chilling detail. He would remove the passenger seat from his car to make it easier to move cargo. The officers understood immediately what he meant. When Chapman lost patience and demanded to know where Kimberly Leach's body was, Bundy only shook his head, saying the scene was too terrible to describe. During his transfer to the Leon County Jail, investigators tried one last time, appealing to him emotionally, telling him Kimberly's parents needed her body to move forward with their lives. Bundy stared at them, crushed his cigarette pack in his fist, and threw it to the floor before answering. "I'm the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet." With that, it was clear he had no intention of confessing to anything. Once word of his arrest broke, the newspapers finally connected the dots. Theodore Bundy, now a name known across the country, sat at the center of a wave of brutal crimes. The case would soon dominate the national media. But before we go further, we need to go back to the beginning, to the first disappearances, the first human skulls found in the forest, and the moment the name that would define American criminal history first surfaced. The earliest case linked to Bundy was the disappearance and murder of 15-year-old Kathy Devine. She vanished from a street corner in North Seattle on November 25, 1973. Witnesses later told police she'd last been seen hitchhiking. Her whereabouts remained unknown until early December, when her badly decomposed body was found face down in a wooded area. She was fully clothed, though her jeans had been cut open at the back. The county medical examiner ruled the cause of death as strangulation and slashing with a sharp object, and noted signs of sexual assault. Because of how the crime scene had degraded, the case went cold almost immediately, and whoever killed her simply disappeared. Then came another case, just as disturbing. The year 1974 had barely begun when 18-year-old student Karen Sparks went to sleep in her basement bedroom in a large student house near the University of Washington campus. On the morning of January 5th, her housemates noticed she hadn't come up for breakfast. At first, they assumed she'd stayed up late and would sleep through to lunch. But as the afternoon wore on, worry set in, and one of her friends went down to check on her. He found Karen unconscious, her face and hair matted with blood. Pulling back the blankets to try to help her, they discovered someone had torn a metal rod from the bed frame and used it to violate her. Karen was rushed to the hospital. Doctors found devastating damage to her bladder and internal organs. The whole community was shaken, but no trace of the attacker was ever found at the scene. The story lingered in the papers for a while, until another case took over the headlines entirely. Through the 1970s, the whole country was in love with morning radio. In Western Washington in 1974, that was no different. Thousands of listeners loved the voice of a young woman who delivered the first news of the day every morning, though almost none of them knew her name. That young woman was Linda Healy, 21 years old. She was close to finishing a psychology degree at the University of Washington and lived in an old student house on campus that she shared with 4 roommates. Linda was, by every account, the picture of an upper-middle-class Washington upbringing. School choir as a child, church performances, a warm and steady sort of girl. As an adult, she'd set her sights on psychology, hoping to work with children who had developmental disabilities. She and her roommates were careful. They all knew about the brutal attack on Karen Sparks, which had happened just a few blocks from their own house, so they kept the doors locked and steered clear of anyone who seemed off. Still, they felt safe. After all, there were 5 of them, living together. Of the 5, Linda kept the busiest schedule. She was up by 5:30 every morning, heading to the offices of the Northwest Ski Report to record the day's snow conditions for a little extra money, then off to class, then home in the evening. Her boyfriend worked long hours, and they rarely saw much of each other. In one of her last letters, Linda wrote that she was planning to have her family over for dinner. She was looking forward to making beef stroganoff and wanted to invite her roommates too. On the evening of February 4, 1974, Linda caught a ride with a friend to campus for choir rehearsal. She came home afterward and borrowed a roommate's car to run to the grocery store for ingredients. Around 8:30 that night, she and a few friends went to Dante's, the most popular bar on campus, split a couple of pitchers of beer, and headed home not long after. Linda went straight to her basement bedroom. None of them knew it would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, her absence was noticed mostly because her alarm clock wouldn't stop ringing. A roommate went down to check and found the bed neatly made, no sign of Linda anywhere. At first it seemed odd, nothing more. But by the time the radio station's morning host was asking on air where his missing co-worker had gotten to, the roommate's unease turned to alarm, and they called the police. The first officers on scene were from the homicide unit. In Linda's room, they found everything tidy. Posters, photographs, all the little things that mattered to her. But when they pulled back the comforter, the pillow was missing its case, and dried blood stained the sheets and mattress beneath. Someone had gotten in, and at the very least, had badly hurt her. Her roommates mentioned the bed usually had a pink satin pillowcase, also missing. One investigator searched the closet and found Linda's nightshirt shoved in the back, its collar stiff with dried blood. It all pointed to the same. Conclusion: someone had come in, knocked her unconscious, and carried her away. Her clothes, jeans, and boots from the bar the night before were gone too, along with a backpack of clothing, suggesting the kidnapper had dressed her before taking her. After Linda's disappearance, her roommates quietly moved out, and a group of male volunteers moved into the house, hoping to draw the attacker back. Investigators combed the neighborhood for days and found nothing. Linda's room, gone over, meticulously, yielded not so much as a stray hair. While the investigation dragged on, a Washington police dispatcher took a strange call. A man on the line claimed the attacker in the basement assault and Linda Healy's abduction were the same person. Suspicion initially fell on Linda's current and former boyfriends, but both passed polygraph tests. As the days passed, homicide detectives began treating the case as a probable kidnapping that had likely ended in murder. Evidence was sent to the Seattle Police Crime Lab, but nothing moved the case forward. Meanwhile, investigators started noticing the pattern connecting Karen's and Linda's cases. Both slept in houses full of young women, both in basement rooms. Karen had been beaten savagely and assaulted. Linda, it seemed, had suffered something similar, except this time, the attacker had taken his victim with him. Her disappearance stayed in the headlines for a long time. She'd been on the verge of finishing her degree, known for her love of working with children. The public's grief was enormous. After she vanished, people who'd only ever known her voice finally learned her face, and the emptiness of not knowing what happened to her stuck with the region for a long, long time. A few kilometers from Seattle, Another disappearance followed, this one at Evergreen State College, southwest of Olympia, Washington. On the night of Tuesday, March 12, 1974, 19-year-old Donna Manson left to see a jazz concert on campus and never came back. Donna had a history of depression, so police initially theorized she might have run away, or worse. That theory fell apart after her writings and drawings were sent for psychiatric evaluation, which found no signs of serious mental illness. Police shifted their search to the campus grounds. Cadaver dogs combed the area for any trace of her. Nothing. Donna's disappearance was the moment several jurisdictions across Washington began to suspect they were looking at the same thing. That suspicion hardened on April 17th, when another disappearance occurred 120 miles from Seattle. This time, the victim was 18-year-old freshman Susan Rancourt, a student at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg. She was last seen after dropping off a load of laundry at her dormitory. When police retraced her route from the night before, they found a faster but riskier path through a construction site, across a footbridge over a campus pond, and under a wooden bridge near the student parking lot. Campus police believed she may have been approached by a stranger somewhere along that path. The theory gained weight when other students came forward describing eerily similar encounters in the days before her disappearance. A tall, good-looking man in his early 20s, arm in a sling, asking for help. Several described him fumbling an armful of books, dropping them, and students stepping in to help gather them up. He'd always ask them to walk him to his car. But the Volkswagen Beetle parked less than 1,000 feet from the wooden bridge. That story repeated itself again and again across the campus. Investigators became convinced Susan had fallen victim to the same man. Still, no real progress followed. 19 days later, at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 250 miles south of Seattle, another disappearance was reported. Roberta Parks, 20, a comparative religion student. On May 6, 1974, she had plans to meet friends at the Student Union building. Before leaving, she told her roommate she'd be back within the hour. She never arrived. Lieutenant Bill Harris of the Oregon Criminal Investigation Unit believed that if she'd run off and taken her own life, her body would have turned up quickly. It didn't. The kidnapping theory gained ground. Around this time, Harris learned of the other missing girl cases spreading across the Pacific Northwest. The cases were linked, and photographs of the missing women were duplicated and circulated to every law enforcement office in the region. Nearly a month later, 22-year-old Brenda Ball was reported missing. She'd last been seen in the parking lot of the Flame Tavern after closing time, talking to a tall, good-looking man with brown hair and his arm in a sling. While Brenda's case was still being investigated, 10 days later, a new case would deepen the fear gripping Washington. In the second week of June 1974, the University of Washington was deep in finals, and 18-year-old Georgian Hawkins was particularly anxious about her Spanish exam. Georgianne was one of the university's most admired students, a member of Kappa Alpha Theta, the most prestigious sorority on campus. She was bright and animated, with long shining hair and lively brown eyes. Though small, standing just over 5 feet and weighing barely 115 pounds. Before college, she'd been a cheerleader and had even been crowned a homecoming princess. Her grades were strong, across the board, except for the one subject giving her trouble, Spanish. In early June, she called home often, at one point telling her family she was tempted to drop the class under the pressure of finals. They talked her through it, and she pushed forward. On the evening of Monday, June 10th, she slipped out with a friend to a party on campus, had a couple of drinks, then explained she needed to get back to study. On her way, she planned to swing by the fraternity where her boyfriend lived to say goodnight. After saying goodbye to him, she walked a short distance and was last seen turning into an alley. When her roommate, Denise Nichols, noticed she was late, she called Georgianne's boyfriend and learned she'd left the fraternity house long ago. Worried, Denise went to the sorority's house mother and reported her missing. The two waited together for hours before finally calling Seattle police in the morning. The first officer to respond was Detective Robert Keppel from the missing. Persons Unit. As soon as he heard the details, his mind jumped straight to the other missing girls whose photos already lined the wall of his office. He felt the fear settle in. Had the kidnapper struck again? Witness statements revealed that several people had called out to Georgianne by name along her route that night, meaning the kidnapper himself may have heard her name called and used it to get close to her in the dark, close enough to overpower her before anyone realized what was happening. The biggest mystery remained. How had nobody seen or heard a single thing? That question is still asked 50 years later. Once the case made headlines, 2 witnesses came forward describing separate incidents on campus. One young woman said she'd been walking to her sorority when she saw a good-looking man on crutches, his leg apparently in a cast, struggling to carry a briefcase that kept slipping from his grip. She offered to help but said she needed to run home first. By the time she came back, he was gone. Looking across all the cases together, investigators realized how close some of these women had come to becoming victims themselves, and that they were dealing with a single man. They also now knew with certainty that at least one of the missing women had already been murdered. That knowledge sharpened the urgency. They had to move before the list of victims grew any longer. On June 3, 1974, more than 100 representatives from police departments across Washington and Oregon gathered at Evergreen State College in Olympia to pool everything they knew. During the meeting, a representative from the Redmond Department mentioned that Kathy Devine's case and Donna Manson's disappearance were still open, but there was a new name on the list. On May 25th, 15-year-old hitchhiker Brenda Baker had vanished. Her body was found more than a month later, badly decomposed, in Miller-Vania State Park. Cause of death, undetermined. Strangely, her remains were found just a few miles from the park where Kathy Devine's body had turned up. The meeting stretched long into the day. Everyone left with a far broader picture of the killer they were hunting, but still no solid lead on his identity. The case sat still until Sunday, July 14th, 1974. That day, the sun beat down hard over Washington, with temperatures expected to hit 90 degrees by evening. Lake Sammamish State Park, famous for its picnics, its beer, its meadows thick with summer wildflowers, filled up fast, and the parking lot stayed packed all day. It was in search of exactly that kind of afternoon that 23-year-old Janice Ott headed to the park. Despite her age, Janice worked as a probation officer at the King County Juvenile Detention Center. Her father, a public school administrator and former member of the state's Parole and Pardon Board, had taught her plenty about the criminal mind, especially psychopathic behavior. None of that was on her mind that Sunday. She simply went to enjoy the day and disappeared sometime around noon. A few hours later, 18-year-old programming student Denise Naslund also arrived at the park. Unlike Janice, Denise came with her boyfriend and another couple. Around 4 in the afternoon, she stepped away from the group to use the restroom and never came back. When both disappearances reached the Seattle Police Department, everyone understood at once. The unidentified killer had struck again, twice, on the same day. Responsibility for the Ott and Naslund cases landed on a team of investigators. Among them, Robert Keppel, a relative newcomer who'd handled only a single homicide case before this, but who would go on to become one of the leading experts on this killer's methods. Keppel and his colleagues interviewed hundreds of people who'd been at the park that weekend. From those interviews, a pattern emerged. A man wearing a sling had approached more than 10 different women in the park that day. He introduced himself the same way every time. Ted, he told them. With help from hundreds of witnesses, a composite sketch was drawn and broadcast statewide. The suspect, this Ted, was described as good-looking, wavy, light brown hair, no visible scars. Some witnesses called him tanned, well-spoken, articulate, with an intense way of staring at the women he approached. Every account agreed on one detail. He drove a faded brown Volkswagen Beetle. The key witness was a young woman who had actually walked with him to his car and leaned against it while he told her about his sailboat and asked for help hauling it from his house. Something about the request struck her as strange enough that she stepped away from the car and the man and rejoined her friends. As the composite spread, calls poured in, friends and neighbors naming every Ted they knew. Most didn't drive a Beetle, had solid alibis, or simply didn't match the sketch closely enough. Investigators, meanwhile, puzzled over one question. Why had he taken 2 women within a 4-hour window? The leading theory was that the killer's compulsion was accelerating, needing more frequent, more intense episodes with each new abduction. In other words, Janice had likely been held somewhere nearby while Denise was being taken. Then he had 2 victims at once, something he'd probably fantasized about for a long time. The way some men fantasize about romance, this man fantasized about something far darker. A double murder. One victim forced to watch the other tortured, assaulted, and killed. It was a thought almost too terrible to hold in the mind. It wouldn't be long before the first physical evidence of exactly that horror surfaced. It was mid-August 1974, the heat still heavy over Washington, when a road construction worker, laboring about 2 miles from Lake Sammamish State Park on Taylor Mountain, caught a horrible smell drifting up from a ravine. He noticed it, but he was hungry, so he simply moved to another spot for lunch and ignored it completely. A month passed. Then, on September 6th, another construction worker caught the same smell, and this time decided to investigate. What he found looked like a jawbone, a rib cage, and part of a human spine. Authorities were called immediately, and the area sealed off. For 4 days, the region was searched inch by inch. Wildlife and the summer heat had already destroyed much of the remains. But sifting through the soil, the forensic team recovered 8 clumps of hair, some long and dark brown, others reddish blonde. In total, they gathered a skull, a rib cage, a spine, the jawbone of a second skull, countless small bone fragments, and 5 femurs. It was clear the bodies had been dumped completely naked. At a later press conference, Seattle Police Captain Nick Mackey announced that the remains of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund had been identified. Alongside them were the remains of 2 more women, still unidentified. With this discovery, a formal task force was assembled, and the best investigators from the Seattle Police Department and King County set up headquarters spanning 2 floors of the county courthouse. The room filled with photographs of the missing and murdered women, a detailed map of the university district, and the composite sketch of Ted. September was tense, but no further breaks came until October 18, 1974, when a new disappearance was reported. This time the victim was 17-year-old Melissa Smith, daughter of the police chief of the small town of Midvale. She'd left home to visit a friend who worked at a local pizza place, planning to head afterward to a sleepover at another friend's house. She never reached either destination. Her body was found sometime later in a mountainous area, near a river close to a parking lot. She was naked, a pair of nylon pantyhose knotted around her neck, and had been beaten so badly her face was unrecognizable. She showed signs of sexual assault. The OSHA medical examiner determined she had survived for 7 days after her disappearance before being killed, meaning she had been held captive. Days later, on Halloween, another young woman, 17-year-old Laura Amy, vanished after leaving her home in Lehi, Utah, for a night out. When her body was found, she too had been strangled with nylon pantyhose. The autopsy noted skull fractures at the back of her head and clear evidence of sexual assault, with semen recovered from her body. The labber tried to determine the attacker's blood type, but by then the samples had degraded too far to be useful. While that discovery was unfolding on one side of Utah, 18-year-old Carol Durange decided to spend an evening at the Fashion Place Mall. She left home in her new Camaro around 6:30 in the evening, ran into some relatives at the mall, and browsed a few stores before stopping at Walden Books to flip through some titles. That's when a man approached her, good-looking, well-dressed, and asked if she'd parked near the Sears entrance. "Yes," Carol said. "Witnesses reported someone trying to break into a car with a coat hanger," he told her. "Sounds like it might have been yours." He carried himself like a police officer, though he wasn't in uniform. Still, Carol followed him out to the parking lot, a light rain falling as they walked. Partway there, she asked to see some identification. He just laughed. Carol felt embarrassed for even asking, like she'd overreacted. When they reached the Camaro, she unlocked it and checked inside. Everything looked untouched. He asked her to open the passenger door too. She refused. He suggested they go find his partner at mall security to compare notes with the suspect they'd caught, hinting Carol might even recognize him. "I was just shopping," she said, confused. "I wouldn't know who that is." He brushed past the comment, and somehow the two of them ended up walking toward an isolated part of the lot. By now Carol was wary and asked again for his badge. "Officer Roseland," he said. "Murray Police Department." They reached a locked door, which seemed to catch him off guard, and he suggested they head to the station instead to file the report properly. Carol expected a patrol car. Instead, he led her to an old Volkswagen Beetle. Something clicked. No plainclothes officer drives a car like this, and she demanded his ID again. He grew impatient but flashed a wallet quickly, giving her only a glimpse of a gold badge. He opened the passenger door and waited for her to get in. Reluctantly, she did. The moment he got behind the wheel, she caught a strong smell of alcohol on his breath. Before she could react, he was already pulling out of the lot. Carol thought about screaming or jumping out, but it felt hopeless in the moment. Then, without warning, he stopped the car. When she looked over, his expression had changed completely. Cold, distant. She took her chance and grabbed for the door, but he lunged across the seat and snapped a handcuff onto her wrist. She screamed, and he pulled out a gun, pressing it to her head, threatening to kill her if she didn't stop. In the struggle, Carol tumbled backward out of the car. She saw the gun fall from his hand. He grabbed a crowbar instead, hauling her up and pinning her against the vehicle. The crowbar came down on her arm, but in a reflex, she kicked him hard between the legs, and he staggered back. Carol bolted for the highway, nearly getting hit by a passing car before a couple pulled over and rushed to help her. Shaking, she was calmed enough to be driven straight to the police station, where officers couldn't get the handcuff off her wrist with any standard key. It had to be removed another way. When police searched the mall, there was no Beetle, no man. Carol tried to pick her attacker out of mugshot books, but found no match. The only physical evidence was a few drops of blood on the collar of her jacket. Typo, but too small a sample to determine anything more specific. When this case reached the task force, they were thrilled. Finally, a survivor. But their relief was short-lived. That same night, another disappearance had occurred. The victim, 17-year-old Deborah Kent, who had vanished during intermission at a school musical at Viewmont High School. Witnesses reported hearing sharp screams from the parking lot between 10:30 and 11 p.m., loud enough that several people rushed outside to check, finding nothing but an empty lot. A friend of Deborah's recalled seeing a strange, good-looking man pacing anxiously near the auditorium that night. The same man was spotted several more times, always agitated, always out of place. When officers searched the school lot, they found a small key that looked oddly familiar. Back at the station, they tried it on Carol Durant's handcuff. It opened instantly. A new witness also came forward. A mother, picking up her daughter after the show, who'd seen a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle speeding out of the lot. Every thread pointed to the same man, the mysterious Ted, now confirmed not just as a kidnapper, but a killer, and he wasn't finished. Christmas of 1974 was a somber one for several families, and 1975 opened just as darkly. In January, nurse Karen Campbell, 23, disappeared from the Wildwood Inn in eastern Salt Lake City, where she'd been staying with her husband. She was last seen in the hallway near her room. Her naked body was found the following month, her head brutally beaten with a heavy object, her body marked with knife wounds. Her killer had also cut off part of her left earlobe. Samples were collected from the scene, but as with the other cases, the trail went cold, and that was only the start of 1975. Snow was melting across Washington's mountains when, on March 1st, 1975, two students from Green River Community College hiked up Taylor Mountain. near Highway 18, for a class project on forest ecology. What they found, instead, had nothing to do with schoolwork. Just a short walk into the trees, they came across a human skull. Police sealed off the area immediately. The skull showed a severe fracture on the left side, consistent with a blow from a heavy object. By this point, the task force had dental records for every missing woman on their list, and it didn't take long to identify the remains as Brenda Ball, missing since the previous June. Detective Robert Keppel led over 200 officers in the search for more remains. The ground was wet, the going slow, and what happened next would haunt Keppel for the rest of his career. A few days into the search, he slipped and slid down a muddy embankment. At the bottom, he came face to face with another human skull. Dental records confirmed it belonged to Susan Rancourt, 18, missing since April of the year before, from Ellensburg, nearly 90 miles away. Investigators began to suspect the killer was using this stretch of forest specifically to dispose of his victims' severed heads. There were no clothes, no other remains, only skulls, suggesting only the heads had been carried here. The team began sifting the wet ground more carefully, one group clearing away mud-caked ferns, another working the earth directly. Before long, a third skull turned up. Roberta Parks, 20, missing a month after Brenda from Corvallis, Oregon, more than 260 miles away. The discovery was chilling in a new way. It meant this man had driven hundreds of miles with his victims' severed heads, carrying them between locations. Every skull recovered so far showed the same pattern, crushing damage from a heavy instrument. The search continued, and eventually a lower jawbone surfaced. Identification took a bit longer, but it was confirmed to belong to Linda Healy, 21, missing since February 1974, the very first victim the task force had ever linked to the case. Though the press was largely kept from the details, theories about cults and Satanism began circulating anyway. One newspaper used the term serial killer for what may have been the first time, a phrase authorities still avoided. Psychiatrists offered deeper theories, suggesting the killer was driven by an obsessive, compulsive need to kill the same type of woman over and over. Something, they believed, had happened involving a beautiful woman with hair parted down the middle, someone he'd never actually harmed, but whose memory he kept punishing through his victims, without ever finding relief. By now, many on the task force were deeply unsettled. Captain Nick Mackey admitted publicly that the case might never be solved. More than 2,200 men resembling the composite sketch had already been questioned, and nearly 900 Volkswagen Beetles identified. Around 200 names remained on the suspect list, a number Mackey still considered far too large. Their killer, he feared, might simply walk free. The task force's frustration was palpable, and over the following months, the disappearances kept coming, one after another. The first of 1975 came in March, when 26-year-old Julie Cunningham vanished. Her roommate said Julie had been going through a rough breakup, and the two had plans to meet at a bar on the night of March 15th. Julie never showed. Of all the disappearances so far, hers would draw the least attention. Weeks later, on April 6, 1975, 25-year-old Denise Oliverson disappeared from the small town of Grand Junction, Colorado. That same month, 18-year-old Melanie Cooley vanished after being seen hitchhiking. Her body was found 8 days later, the back of her head beaten, a pillowcase knotted around her neck. The following July, 24-year-old Shelley Robertson disappeared after being seen talking to a man at a gas station in Golden, Colorado, a man driving an old pickup truck. Her body turned up a month later, badly decomposed. Cause of death undetermined. Every one of these victims shared the ibis dactyloides, same trait, long hair, parted down the middle. After this string of disappearances, the killing stopped, and an event that would set the entire case toward its final chapter finally took place. It was 2:30 in the morning on August 16, 1975, when Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward pulled his cruiser up outside his own house. Still sitting in the car, he saw a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle roll past his home. Hayward was the suspicious type by nature, and something about it caught his attention immediately. This was a quiet residential street, and he'd never once seen a beetle cruising through it, let alone at that hour. Without hesitation, he flipped on his headlights and jotted down the plate. The beetle's lights snapped off, and it sped away. That only deepened Hayward's suspicion. He turned the cruiser around and gave chase. Eventually, the driver gave up and pulled into an abandoned gas station. Hayward parked behind the beetle, and out stepped a young man in jeans. A black turtleneck and sneakers, his hair long, tousled, faintly curled. Hayward noted the man had blown through 2 stop signs at high speed and asked for his license. It read, Theodore Robert Bundy, resident of Salt Lake City. Still suspicious, Hayward asked what he was doing out there at that hour. "I was at a drive-in," Bundy said, "watching the towering inferno out in Redwood. Got a little lost on the way home." There was a problem. The drive-in sat squarely inside Hayward's patrol area, and he knew for a fact it wasn't showing that film. As they talked, a second patrol car arrived, and the officers inside watched the exchange to make sure Hayward was safe. That's when the sergeant leaned in and noticed the passenger's seat of the Beetle had been removed entirely and shoved into the back. Hayward asked to search the car and found a small crowbar on the floor behind the driver's seat and an open bag near the front. Shining his flashlight inside, he found far more than he expected. A ski mask, an ice pick, a coil of rope, and some wire. All classic burglary tools. Hayward arrested Bundy on suspicion of evading an officer. At the station, Bundy was questioned and the bag searched more thoroughly. Inside, they found even stranger items. A mask fashioned from a woman's pantyhose, a pair of handcuffs, and in the trunk, several large green plastic trash bags. When asked about the items, Bundy claimed he'd simply found them on his way home. Hayward wasn't buying it. The tools looked like classic burglary equipment, and he confiscated everything as evidence for a possible burglary tools charge. The next morning, Bundy was released on his own recognizance. No bail required. Later, prosecutors issued a formal warrant charging him with possession of burglary tools. As all this unfolded, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office grew increasingly interested in Theodore Bundy, wondering if he might be the Ted the task force had been hunting for over a year. A search warrant for his apartment followed, and investigators turned up a few notable items: a copy of The Joy of Sex by Alex Comfort, and a map of Colorado's ski resorts. When asked, Bundy insisted he'd never even been to Colorado. Another item that caught their attention was a brochure for a recreation center in Bountiful, Utah. Again, Bundy denied any connection, claiming the brochure belonged to a friend who'd recently visited. During the search, one investigator found a pair of polished leather shoes in a closet. Oddly, when they returned later with an official search warrant, the shoes had vanished. Investigators' suspicion of Bundy only grew. Many believed he might be tied to the Utah killings, but they lacked hard evidence. No jewelry, no clothing, no purses that could connect him directly to any victim. When they photographed his Beetle, though, it matched the description Carol Durant had given. Carol was brought in to look at photographs of the car and of Bundy himself. At first, she struggled to identify him, but eventually she did. As for the Beetle, she wasn't entirely certain, though she noted the back seat had had a small tear during her abduction that now appeared to have been stitched closed in the photos. A friend of Deborah Kent's, along with other witnesses who'd seen the strange man near the auditorium the night Deborah vanished, were also brought in, and they, too, identified him. The turning point came when Bundy was placed in a lineup alongside other men, and Carol and the other witnesses picked him out without hesitation. With that confirmation, investigators set up surveillance on Bundy and pulled his school and work records. Family and friends were contacted in an effort to piece together who Theodore Robert Bundy really was. That's the story we'll pick up next: who he was and how he became this. Theodore Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother was Louise Cowell. His father's identity has never been confirmed. Aronik, his birth certificate, filled out at a home for unwed mothers. The father was initially listed as Lloyd Marshall, a traveling salesman and Air Force veteran. In a later version of the certificate, that name was removed entirely, leaving the space blank. For years, rumors circulated that Bundy's real father might have been Louise's own father, Samuel Cowell, a suggestion of incest within the family. DNA testing in 2020 finally ruled that out. Louise herself once claimed the biological father was a man named Jack Worthington, though investigators found so many men by that name, and by the name Lloyd Marshall, living in the area at the time that nothing could ever be confirmed. To this day, Bundy's paternity remains unknown. In his earliest years, Bundy was raised by his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. To avoid the social stigma of unwed motherhood, Louise was presented to the world as his older sister, while her parents raised him as their own son. Bundy would eventually uncover the truth on his own, a discovery that left him deeply resentful of his mother. Even before he learned the truth about his birth, though, Bundy showed troubling signs. His aunt, Julia Cowell, once described waking from a nap to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives, and at the foot of the bed stood little Ted, just a small child, smiling at her. Growing up, Bundy respected his grandparents deeply, especially his grandfather Samuel, whom he saw almost as a father figure. Later in life, though, he would describe Samuel as a violent, racist, xenophobic man. Though many biographers believe Bundy painted this picture later simply to deflect blame from himself, his grandmother Eleanor, by contrast, was remembered as quiet and submissive, entirely devoted to her husband. In the mid-1950s, Bundy and his mother moved to Washington State, where Louise began attending a local church. At a singles social event there, she met Johnny Bundy, whom she would go on to marry. Johnny formally adopted Theodore, who took on the Bundy surname. Though Johnny made real efforts to bond with his stepson, the two never grew close. Much of Bundy's early life wasn't uncovered by investigators until much later, but understanding it helps explain how he came to be. He would later say his fixation on women began in adolescence, a period that also saw him peering into neighbors' windows at night. According to psychologist Dr. Alan Carter, Bundy showed an early persistent hunger to be somebody important, mimicking the speech patterns of politicians and public figures he heard on the radio. Accounts of his childhood and teenage years vary wildly. Some neighbors described a genuinely cruel child. One story claims he hanged a stray cat from a clothesline, doused it in lighter fluid, and set it on fire. Another account describes him leading neighborhood children into the woods, undressing them and himself, and digging pits lined with sharpened stakes, in which, by some accounts, at least one girl was hurt. As he grew older, Bundy seemed to struggle with the basic mechanics of friendship. In later interviews, he noted that people saw him as shy, but the truth, he said, was that he simply never learned how to connect with anyone. In high school, classmates remembered him as well-liked and active, including in alpine skiing, a sport he reportedly pursued using stolen gear and forged lift tickets. During this period, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and car theft, marking the start of a criminal streak that would only escalate. When Bundy turned 18, his juvenile arrest record was wiped clean, standard practice in Washington and many other states at the time. In 1965, he enrolled at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. It was there he met Diane Edwards, a young woman from a wealthy family, and the two had a brief relationship. Through 1968, as Diane graduated and moved to San Francisco, Bundy drifted through a series of low-paying jobs. He volunteered on Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign and worked as a driver and bodyguard on Art Fletcher's campaign for Washington lieutenant governor. Despite these efforts, his immaturity and lack of direction frustrated Diane, and the relationship ended. The breakup hit him hard, and he took off on a string of aimless trips: Colorado, Arkansas, Philadelphia, seemingly chasing some kind of answer about himself. In 1969, digging into his own past, He uncovered the truth about his birth. He was illegitimate, with no confirmed father. The discovery left him deeply shaken. That fall, back in Washington, Bundy met Elizabeth Kendall, a woman with whom he would begin a relationship lasting several years. When investigators later reached out to her, she agreed to speak with them, but only off the record. According to her account, Bundy often disappeared at night and left strange items lying around the house and car. Once she found a tire iron half-wrapped in tape, along with an Asian-style knife and a cleaver. She also said he confessed, more than once, to stealing things on impulse, purely for the thrill of it. As for their relationship, Elizabeth said that after Bundy bought a copy of The Joy of Sex, his behavior grew increasingly strange, an interest in bondage and anal sex. On 3 occasions, he asked her to tie his hands to the bed. The 3rd time, he began choking her mid-act, leaving her deeply frightened. Despite all this, Elizabeth also described him as a genuinely loving father figure to her daughter Molly, a striking contrast between the warmth he showed his family and the darkness that surfaced in private. As his relationship with Elizabeth continued, Bundy seemed to sharpen into a more focused, ambitious version of himself. He began studying psychology at the University of Washington, becoming an honors student well-liked by professors and classmates alike. The following year, he took a job at the Seattle Crisis Clinic, answering emergency calls from people in distress. In 1972, Bundy graduated and threw himself into politics, working on Governor Daniel Evans's re-election campaign. He impressed the governor enough to earn a recommendation to the state's Law and Justice Planning Office. After the election, he continued climbing, becoming an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, who described him as a sharp, driven, young man who genuinely believed in the system. By 1973, with a stack of recommendation letters from political and academic figures, Bundy secured a spot studying law at the University of Puget Sound. That same year, on a business trip, he reconnected with his old girlfriend Diane Edwards, who was struck by how much he'd changed. Now a rising figure in law and politics, the relationship rekindled, growing serious enough that he introduced her as his fiancée at social events. Then, in January 1974, Bundy abruptly cut Diane off, ignoring her calls and letters entirely. When she finally managed to reach him and confronted him about it, he claimed he had no idea what she was talking about. After that, he began to lose interest in his once promising academic path, missing classes, drifting from his responsibilities. By April 1973, he'd dropped out of law school altogether. It was during this exact stretch of time that the wave of disappearances began. It's worth pausing to note. The entire episode with Diane happened while Bundy was still involved with Elizabeth Kendall. He began going out more and more at night, often taking Elizabeth's light-colored Beetle. His drinking increased sharply too, something Elizabeth noticed and grew increasingly worried about. In 1974, as the disappearances and murders kept terrorizing the region, Bundy landed a position with the Washington State Department of Emergency Services, an agency directly involved in the search for the missing women, a detail that would leave the task force stunned once they learned it. Once investigators had pieced together a detailed picture of Bundy's life, with Elizabeth Kendall's help, they began confirming his whereabouts against the dates of each disappearance. Elizabeth revealed she had already reported her suspicions about him to police 3 separate times, reports that had gone nowhere until his eventual arrest. Investigators then discovered that Bundy had recently sold his Beetle. Dismantling the car, they found crucial evidence: strands of hair matching samples recovered from Karen Campbell's body. Other hairs in the car matched Melissa Smith and Carol Durant. Though the evidence was microscopic, FBI hair analyst Robert Neal stated it would be extraordinarily unlikely for hair from 3 unrelated victims to end up in the same vehicle unless all 3 had encountered the same man. The task force was now convinced Bundy was the Ted from Lake Sammamish and the killer behind a string of brutal crimes, but they needed something stronger to charge him with murder. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the kidnapping of Carol Durant. The trial lasted 4 days. He was found guilty of kidnapping and aggravated assault and sentenced to 15 years in prison. He was sent to the Utah State Prison, where he quickly showed signs of planning an escape. Guards found road maps, flight schedules, and a social security card in his possession during a search. While he sat in prison, Colorado prosecutors filed formal murder charges against him for Karen Campbell's death, a crucial step toward tying him directly to the killings. In 1977, Bundy was extradited to Aspen and spent much of the legal process shuffling through the Pitkin County Courthouse, presenting himself in interviews as a wrongly accused man determined to clear his name. During one court appearance, he asked to visit the courthouse law library to prepare his own defense, and while the guards were distracted, he jumped from a second-story window. He injured his ankle in the fall, but managed to escape, staying at large for several days. He found refuge in the forest, hiding out in a hunting cabin where he found food, clothes, and a rifle. His plan was to reach the nearest town, but he got lost in the woods, wandering without direction. At one point, he broke into a camper trailer near Maroon Lake for more supplies and pushed north, trying to avoid roadblocks. 3 days after his escape, exhausted and sleepless, he stole a car and, driving erratically, drew the attention of 2 officers who pulled him over and arrested him again. Back in custody, things only got worse. Before the escape, there had still been a real chance of acquittal on the murder charge. His lawyers believed that if he beat it, other jurisdictions would struggle to build cases of their own. His 15-year kidnapping sentence might even have been reduced, putting freedom back within reach. But the escape changed everything. And Bundy, it turned out, wasn't done taking risks. While held in the Garfield County Jail, he somehow got hold of a detailed floor plan of the entire building. So on December 23, 1977, with most of the guards home for the Christmas holidays and the lower-risk inmates released to spend the day with family, Bundy made his move. What followed is almost hard to believe. Having quietly starved himself down over several months in preparation, he pried the light fixture from the ceiling of his cell and crawled through the crawl space above, emerging in a guard's private quarters. He grabbed a change of clothes and simply walked out the front door of the jail. He stole a car and drove east until it broke down on Interstate 70. After a long, winding journey, including a flight, he finally arrived at the campus of Florida State University, found a room in a boarding house nearby, and tried to live quietly, avoiding any attention from police. He picked up a short-lived construction job, but quit after being asked for identification. After struggling to find steady work, he went back to stealing credit cards and cash. About a week after he arrived in Tallahassee, the sorority attacks and murders happened. That same night, he also attacked Cheryl Thompson. Days later, he drove to Lake City and abducted Kimberly Leach. Not long after that, he was pulled over by Officer Daniel Lee, the encounter that ended, as we already know, in his final arrest. After arrest, Theodore Bundy would never be a free man again. Which brings us back to where this story started. While Bundy was being questioned by Detective Norman Chapman, the white van he'd been driving was found abandoned. Forensic technicians combed through it, collecting leaves and bark fragments both inside the cabin and caught in the undercarriage. A detailed botanical analysis traced the vegetation to North Florida, possibly near the banks of the Suwannee River, which runs along the state's border. Following that lead, search teams pushed miles into the surrounding wilderness until they found an adult sneaker, strands of human hair, and other evidence near the town of Branford, all pointing toward the isolated back roads bordering Suwannee River State Park. A few days later, the remains of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach were finally found. It explained why Bundy had refused to say where her body was. The scene, he'd claimed, was too horrible to put into words. Kimberly's remains were badly decomposed, already mummified, discovered in a hog shed near the park more than 30 miles from where she'd vanished. When the body was examined, the cause of death proved to be exceptionally violent. It appeared Kimberly had suffocated in mud during the attack and had also suffered severe wounds to her throat and body from a knife. Of every case ever tied to Bundy, Kimberly Leach's murder may have been the most brutal of all. With that, multiple jurisdictions began preparing charges, and prosecutors made clear they would settle for nothing short of the death penalty. Before the trials began, Bundy was offered a deal: plead guilty to the murders of Margaret Bowen, Lisa Hartley, and Kimberly Leach, and avoid execution. Prosecutors were ready to accept it, and for a while, Bundy seemed open to the idea too, since it meant staying alive. But at the last moment, he backed out, unwilling to publicly admit to the killings. With strong evidence in hand from both Tallahassee and Lake City, Bundy was formally indicted for murder and related charges in May 1978. His trial, the first ever televised nationally in the United States, drew enormous media attention. Bundy, who frequently dismissed his own lawyers, tried at times to represent himself, but the prosecution's case was strong. Nora Hayes, who'd heard him at the crime scene, testified, along with forensic odontologists who confirmed his bite marks matched the wounds on Lisa Hartley's body. Carol Daranch also testified about her own abduction. The jury took less than 7 hours to convict him on all counts: murder, attempted murder, and burglary. Judge Edward Cowart sentenced him to death. 6 months later, at his trial for Kimberly Leach's murder, witnesses came forward who had seen him with her. Prosecutors also presented strong forensic evidence, fiber matches from her clothing, reinforcing the case against him. In a bizarre twist during that trial, Bundy proposed marriage to a woman named Carol Boone while on the stand, exploiting a loophole in Florida law that recognized a declaration of marriage made before a judge in open court as legally binding. In front of everyone, he announced they were officially married, a final, almost theatrical display of his own self-regard. On February 10, 1980, Theodore Bundy was sentenced to death for the murder of Kimberly Leach, execution by electric chair. Before storming out of the courtroom, he turned back to the room and declared that everyone there was wrong. His mother, Louise, pleaded for mercy from both the families and the court, but no leniency came. He was sent to Florida State Prison. Over the following years, Bundy continued to receive visitors. On one occasion, he bribed guards for a private moment with Carol Boone, and in October 1982, their daughter, Rose Bundy, was born. During his early years on death row, Bundy agreed to a series of interviews with Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth. He spoke about his crimes only in the third person, carefully distancing himself even in his own words. Later, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit agent William Hagmeyer was assigned to draw more out of him. Surprisingly, the two developed something close to a rapport. Bundy genuinely seemed to like him. After many sessions, Bundy finally began confessing directly, dropping the third-person distance and openly admitting he was the killer. According to Hagmeyer's notes, Bundy described his victims as becoming, in some sense, part of him, and the places where he killed them as almost sacred, holding an irresistible pull. He described the murders as something close to a mystical experience, one that let him fully possess his victims. His earliest kills, he said, had been amateurish, but by 1974, he'd become a complete predator. Hagmeyer took this as strong evidence that Bundy's true first victims predated even Karen Sparks and Linda Healy. Around this same time, Seattle was grappling with the Green River Killer, and Bundy offered to help the task force analyze the case. He shared some genuinely useful insight, though Gary Ridgway would remain free for more than another decade. By 1986, Bundy's execution date had been set and postponed multiple times. During this stretch, still in regular contact with Hagmeyer, Bundy began sharing more disturbing details about what he did to his victims. About Laura Aim, he admitted he'd washed her hair repeatedly after death. About Melissa Smith, he said, he'd applied makeup to her face. When Hagmeyer pressed him about decapitations, Bundy admitted to beheading 12 of his victims with a hacksaw. keeping some of the heads in his apartment for a time before finally disposing of them. One of the most horrifying admissions concerned the double murder at Lake Sammamish. Bundy confirmed he had, in fact, kept both women alive long enough to force each to watch the other die. His execution was finally scheduled for January 24, 1989. Though some claimed the process had dragged on too long, the truth was his own attorneys never pushed to delay it. The legal path to his execution moved comparatively fast. In his final conversation, Bundy called Detective Robert Keppel and confessed to killing every victim across Washington and Oregon he'd long been suspected in, but never convicted of. He revealed Donna Manson's body was somewhere on Taylor Mountain, and that he'd burned her head in the fireplace at Elizabeth Kendall's house. As his execution date closed in, Bundy also confessed to investigators handling cases in Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. Many of them murders police had never even connected to him, including 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox, killed in September 1974 in Utah. He said he'd found her wandering a poorly lit street, abducted her, and kept her at his apartment for a full day before killing her. Her remains were dumped in Capitol Reef National Park, though investigators were never able to locate them. Bundy also admitted that a month before killing Nancy, he'd assaulted and strangled a hitchhiker in Idaho, then returned to the scene the next day to photograph the body before dismembering it and scattering the remains in a nearby river. He confided that many of his victims had been photographed after death, though none of those photographs were ever recovered. Even as his confessions continued, Bundy withheld certain details, apparently hoping the stream of new information might buy him more time. At one point admitting there were still remains buried that had never been found. His final attorney, Diana Weiner, tried reaching out to victims' families, hoping some would request a delay so Bundy could reveal more. The families refused, saying they already knew he was guilty and needed no formal confession to confirm it. Carol Boone, mother of his daughter, felt utterly betrayed by the confessions. She had genuinely believed in his innocence up until then. Their relationship deteriorated in the years that followed, and Carol's life spiraled into isolation and grief. On his last night, Bundy spoke with Hagmeyer and seemed at moments ready to take his own life, saying he didn't want to give the state the satisfaction of watching him die. Hagmeyer managed to calm him, and guards made sure he made it through the night. During that final conversation, the two went through the full list of victims together, arriving at a total of 30 confirmed homicides. Bundy also confessed that night to killing Julie Cunningham, Denise Oliverson, and 12-year-old Lynette Culver, though none of their remains were ever recovered. Hours before his execution, Bundy was offered a final meal. He declined it. Theodore Bundy was executed in the electric chair on Tuesday, January 24, 1989, at 7:16 in the morning. When news of his death was confirmed, hundreds of people gathered outside the prison, set off fireworks, and cheered. Applause broke out as the hearse drove past. In his will, he'd asked to be cremated. His ashes were scattered at an undisclosed site in Washington's Cascade Mountains. In the years since, debate has continued over just how many people Bundy actually killed. Some believe he began well before his 20s, though this remains speculation. Throughout his years of killing, Bundy built powerful psychological walls to distance himself from what he'd done, deflecting blame onto others, painting his grandfather as a monster, at times even blaming his own illegitimacy, or, in one of his final interviews, pornography itself. In the end, Bundy never appeared to fully reckon with the scale of what he'd done. Long-running serial killers, researchers note, often build exactly this kind of denial, walls that almost never come down. If there's one killer who ever managed to break through that wall entirely, it may have been the BTK killer, who described his own crimes with an almost clinical coldness Bundy never matched. Bundy, until the very end, kept something locked away, details he carried with him, silent all the way to the chair.